Hello and welcome back once again to Gospel First. I'm your host, Joe Cirillo, and I'm grateful that you're here with us today as we start week 4. As we continue, remember that this isn't about collective verses, it's about becoming a different kind of person in Christ. 10 quiet minutes a day, consistently offered, makes room for lasting change. So today we're in Matthew 22 and 23, and Jesus is going to clarify what matters most. It's not appearances, not religious performance, but love, humility, and a heart that matches the life. So if you've ever felt tired of looking spiritual or weighed down by expectations, today is for you. So let's begin. In this particular verse here in Matthew 22, verses 1 to 14, Jesus begins with a parable. The kingdom of heaven is like unto a certain king, which made a marriage for his son. That's in verse 2. The invitations go out, but many refuse to come in verse 3. Some ignore it. Some react with hostility in verse 6. So in verse 9, the king opens the invitation a little wider, and it says, Go ye therefore into the highways, and as many as ye shall find, bid to the marriage. The message here is clear. God's invitation is generous, but it must be received, not assumed. What's the principle? God's grace is offered freely, but it must be personally embraced. Next, in Matthew 22, verses 15 to 22, the religious leaders try to trap Jesus. Now, they ask about paying taxes. So in verse 21, Jesus asks for a coin and says, Render therefore unto Caesar the things which are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. Jesus doesn't avoid the question, he just reframes it. Our lives belong in the world, but our hearts belong to God. So here's something to think about. What parts of my life belong to God, but I sometimes hold back? And where might Jesus be inviting deeper surrender? Next, in Matthew chapter 22, verses 34 to 40, there's the greatest commandment. In verse 36, it says that there's another question that comes. This one is really sincere. It says, Master, which is the great commandment in the law? And Jesus answers simply and beautifully in verse 37. He says, Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, and with all thy mind. Then he adds in verse 39, Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. And then he concludes with verse 40. And on these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. As you see here, everything else rests here. Love God, love people. So the principle here is that true righteousness is measured by love, not complexity. Next, in Matthew 23, verse 1 to 12, it's when religion becomes heavy. In Matthew 23, Jesus speaks plainly. He warns about leaders who love position more than people. They bind heavy burdens and grievous to be borne and lay them on men's shoulders. That was verse 4. Then in verse 11, Jesus says something freeing. He that is greatest among you shall be your servant. So here we see that God is not impressed by titles. He is moved by humility. So here's something to think about. Do I ever make faith heavier than Jesus really intended? And how can I serve more simply? Next, in verses 23 to 28, it's about clean on the outside. So here in verses 23 to 28, Jesus speaks with sorrow, not cruelty. He says in verse 23, You pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin, and have omitted the weightier matters of the law, judgment, mercy, and faith. Then he says in verse 27, You are like unto whited sepulchres, which indeed appear beautiful outward, but are within full of dead men's bones. Now this is not to shame, it is to invite integrity. God desires hearts aligned with actions. What's the principle? God cares more about the inner transformation than outward appearance. Next, in Matthew 23, verses 37 to 39, Jesus ends not with anger, but grief. He sits at the outside of Jerusalem. In verse 37, he says, O Jerusalem, how often would I have gathered thy children together, even as a hen gathered her chickens under her wings, and ye would not. You can see here that this is the heart of Christ. Not rejection, but longing. God never stops wanting to gather his people close. So what we see here in Matthew 22 and 23 reminds us that God is not looking for perfect religious performance. He is looking for willing hearts, humble service, and love that moves outward. So if today you feel burdened by expectations or tired of trying to look right, remember this: Jesus does not pile on weight. He lifts it. And he still invites us not in heavier religion, but into deeper love. So that's it for today. Thank you for staying faithful to the journey. May the Spirit continue to fill your heart and draw you closer to Jesus Christ. If your heart feels even a gentle nudge, I invite you to subscribe and share so that we can spread the gospel of Jesus Christ together. And I'll see you tomorrow as we continue walking with Matthew in Matthew chapter 24. So until then, God bless.